Hello, and welcome to The Real USA. Today we're in DuPont Circle in one of the oldest sectors of Washington, D.C. On November 4th, 37% of eligible voters in the United States came out to cast their ballots in the midterm elections. Only 8% of those were Latinos. On today's show, we'll talk about voter ID laws and the potential implications they could have on election turnout. I'm Alexandra Hall. As you watch these stories, I encourage you to share your feedback by posting on our Twitter @Telesur English. For decades, residents in many states had to only provide their names and addresses in order to vote in federal elections. But in recent years, dozens of states have enacted voter ID laws that require government-issued photo ID. And it's not always easy to get that in the United States. Clara Ibarra has the story.
Las elecciones de 2008 fueron históricas.
The 2008 elections were historical as Barack Obama was elected the first black president in U.S. history. The Latino and African American vote was essential for this achievement of the Democratic Party.
En estados con una amplia historia discriminatoria.
In some historically discriminative states, the participation of these sectors were granted by a law that was in effect for more than 50 years and was revoked by the Supreme Court in 2013, promoting new laws that restrict the democratic participation.
One important part of the Voting Rights Act was a provision called Section 5 that required certain places that had a history of discriminatory voting practices, to actually have any change they make to their voting law or procedure cleared by the federal government or by a panel of judges before they could go into effect. The Supreme Court in a 2013 case called Shelby County versus Holder invalidated the formula that the law used to determine what places had to do this. Immediately after, we saw that the places that used to be covered by this law began implementing laws that made it more difficult to vote.
These new voting laws were approved by the federal government or a panel of judges before they went into effect. The new laws have been promoted by politicians of the Republican Party and are now in effect in 21 states. Now voters, among other restrictions, must show an ID with a picture if they want to vote. This may look elemental, but in the U.S., with more than 45 million immigrants, there's no national identity document.
There are 21 states that have laws this year in this election on the books that were not on the books 4 years ago. These run a range. We have laws that require people to show photo ID when they're voting, laws that make it more difficult for people to vote on days other than Election Day, laws that make it more difficult to register to vote.
The main supporter of these voter ID laws is ALEC, an organization linked with the Republican Party and financed by corporations. One of its co-founders, Paul Weyrich, who died in 2008, maintains that the vote should be considered a privilege, only for some people.
I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
ALEC, it stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council, and it's an organization of state legislators and corporations and right-wing, highly ideological think tanks. And they meet behind closed doors to develop model legislation that the legislators introduce in their own name. And in many cases, the model legislation that ALEC adopts benefits the same corporations that are funding ALEC.
Economic and political powers acting through the Republican Party have reverted history by creating voter ID laws, one of the multiple barriers that nowadays are restricting the right to vote in the U.S. I'm Clara Ibarra with Jose Monsalve and Elizabeth Press, Telesur, New York.
According to the New York justice system, voter ID laws were enacted in order to combat electoral fraud. But evidence shows that new legislation could disproportionately suppress voter participation in African American and Latino communities.
En los últimos 4 años, el panorama electoral en Estados Unidos ha experimentado grandes cambios.
In the last 4 years, the electoral picture in the U.S. has gone through some strong changes, as several laws that restrict the voting process in 21 states have been approved. An example of these restrictions is the voter ID law, which makes it mandatory for the voter to present specific identification documents that around 11% of the U.S. population doesn't have.
No tiene.
A lot of different states around the U.S. have, in the past few years, passed very restrictive and discriminatory photo ID laws. Unlike a lot of other countries in Europe and South America, there is no national ID in the United States. And so poor people and people of color, including Black people, Latino people, disproportionately lack in the U.S. any form of state-issued or government-issued ID.
Last month, a federal judge ruled that Texas's voter ID law was discriminatory. We had a witness in that case, an elderly woman who was born in Mississippi, moved to Chicago, and ended up in the last few years living in Texas. She wanted to vote. But in order for her to vote with a voter ID, she had to get her birth certificate from Mississippi. That birth certificate would cost her $42. She lived on a fixed income. That fixed income came entirely from her Social Security, and she was also helping to support her family. The state's lawyers asked her, "Ma'am, why can't you just pay the $42 for your birth certificate in Mississippi so that you can vote?" And she told them, "I can't eat that birth certificate. I can't make that turn into food on the table."
These laws were created to fight electoral fraud. Nevertheless, what they have achieved so far is to restrict the votes of the elderly, Latinos, and African Americans, groups that in previous elections have been mainly Democrats.
Un informe del Brennan Center for Justice.
A report from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University indicates that it is more likely to be struck by lightning than for this kind of electoral fraud that this law tries to eradicate to occur.
Voter ID proposes to address a very specific kind of voter fraud. The kind of voter fraud where a person appears at the polls and says that they're a person that they're not. This kind of fraud is very rare, and it's the only kind of thing that voter ID addresses. Meanwhile, we have evidence reported by states themselves and approved by courts that many, many voters don't have the kind of ID that these strict ID laws require. In September, the state of Virginia released a figure saying that almost 200,000 registered active Virginia voters do not have a state ID issued by the State Department of Motor Vehicles, which is only one of several kinds of ID that that state permits for people to show to register to vote.
Meanwhile, the communities most affected by these laws and the lawyers that support them try to defy the effect of these restrictions. The right to vote is not a universal reality in almost half of the United States. I'm Clara Ibarra with Jose Monsalve and Elizabeth Press, Telesur, New York.
On October 18th, Texas passed one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country. As it stands now, some 60,000 people in the state don't have the appropriate documentation to vote in a federal election. Let's watch this next report from our correspondent Clara Ibarra in New York.
Texas tiene un papel protagónico.
Texas has played a major role in the fight against voting restrictions.
Una demanda de este estado.
In the U.S., there was a claim that Texas asked the Supreme Court to change the jurisprudence revoking the norm that prevented the implementation of new voting requirements. Currently, around 600,000 people do not have the required ID to exercise their right to vote.
The Texas state legislature passed and later actually started to enforce a law called SB 14 that only allows 7 forms of state-issued government ID, and that we proved through trial this past September that 600,000 voters in Texas lack that form of ID, and a disproportionate share of those voters are Black and Latino.
The individual insistence made by Texas to the voters is now being repeated in several states around the country.
Well, what I think that we're seeing is the United States on the brink of an enormous and really hopeful demographic shift. It's estimated by the Census Bureau in the U.S. that by about 2060, the year 2060, the United States may become a country that's majority not white, and that can be a really exciting thing and something that I think culturally America should embrace. Instead, unfortunately, in Texas and beyond, we've seen a lot of people in power
rather than to embrace this demographic shift and try to respond to the needs of new communities of American voters, try to change the rules of engagement in our democracy, and rather than to include people, seek to pass laws such as these discriminatory photo ID laws that we've seen in Texas, in Wisconsin, and North Carolina, for example, and try to make it, in fact, more difficult for people of color to vote, for young people, and for people who are marginalized in a lot of other ways.
In Texas, you can vote using your concealed carry handgun permit. But if you have a student ID, you can't use that to prove who you are at the polls.
One of our clients in the Texas case is a young woman named Imani Clark. She lives in Texas. She's an undergraduate student, but she is originally from California. So the only forms of ID that she possesses are California IDs and her student ID. She's never traveled abroad, so she doesn't have a U.S. passport. Before Texas passed its law, Ms. Clark was able to vote in Texas legally, where she's registered to vote legally, using her student ID, which shows that she goes to a historically black college called Prairie View in Texas. Because of Texas's new ID law, however, she's not able to vote. She doesn't, as I said, have a U.S. passport. She doesn't have a Texas driver's license because she's a student and doesn't have a car.
La histórica ley de 1965 del derecho al voto.
The historic 1965 right to vote law prevented some states with discriminatory records to exclude voters with the imposition of artificial requirements. Followed by Texas leadership, Americans are reviving the old days that seem to be in the past. I'm Clara Ibarra with Jose Monsalve and Elizabeth Press, Telesur, New York.
Telesur, Nueva York.
We now go to our correspondent Karina Cartagena in New York for the details on the context of U.S. congressional elections.
In New York, the voting centers opened with few people in line. They were voting for their representatives in the Congress, the state governor, and members of the state Senate. The economy was the main concern for voters.
New Yorker, the same issues in some way. Income inequality is a big, big problem. In New York City, we have very, very rich people, and I'm happy for those who actually earned it and are doing well, but there's far too many people who work hard and just don't bring in enough money to make ends meet.
Those who voted didn't hide their lack of optimism for a better economic future and for the role of Congress.
Who's in power and how things have been going. If things had been going very bad, the party that's in usually gets hit. But if things are going reasonably well, the party that's in usually gets reelected.
In New York, as in other states, national organizations set up voter protection centers where phone calls were received to clear up doubts and to file complaints about the voting process. Cesar could not vote due to his migratory status. However, he volunteered in one of the centers helping Latino voters.
According to the national organizations, apathy in mid-term elections was cause for disappointment over lack of actions by Congress regarding economy, health, migration, and national security, considered for national interest.
According to national organizations, apathy in midterm elections was caused by disappointment over lack of action by Congress on the economy, health, immigration, and national security. Karina Cartagena, Telesur, New York.
Once Republicans took control of the Senate on Election Day, it didn't take long before we heard strong reactions not only from both parties, but also from the public. In our next report, we'll hear from Latino community leaders, union workers, and even President Obama on the future of the Democratic Party.
The sun has risen once again in the U.S. However, today isn't just any other day. Congress has new leaders. As predicted, the Republican Party took control of the Congress, and Latino support for Democrats fell mainly because of a non-existent immigration reform. However, these organizations are sure the results will have a negative effect on the Latino community.
La posibilidad de que los republicanos van a apoyar una reforma migratoria que incluye.
It is absurd to consider Republicans will support immigration reform and path to citizenship and legalization. They block the reform. putting the blame on illegal Latino immigrants for all of the problems the country is going through.
The largest work union says that this is a contradiction. Several voters from different states supported an improvement of working conditions as well as a minimum wage increase. Paradoxically, they largely supported Republican candidates who opposed the social initiatives.
But more of them heard from Republicans about the economy than they heard from Democrats. In addition to that, they were strong and assertive. And when people are afraid, they're nervous about their future, somebody who's strong and assertive gets more votes. So that's what happened. But if you look at the agenda, they weren't voting for a Republican agenda.
Many believe the results of these legislative elections are a clear defeat for Democrats. However, these results might be deeply evaluated.
Now Republicans will show who they really are, and that they are really not in favor of common Americans. A popular proposal will be made, which could eventually help future Democratic candidates.
Though Democrats see this from a different perspective, the results clearly mean a rejection of the president.
So to everyone who voted, I want you to know that I hear you. To the 2/3 of voters who chose not to participate in the process yesterday, I hear you too. All of us have to give more Americans a reason to feel like the ground is stable beneath their feet.
President Obama has 2 years left to prove he actually pays attention to the American people. Francesca Emanuel, Washington, Telesur.
What does the future look like with Republicans in control of both houses of Congress? Well, many people are asking that same question, and analysts say that it could have serious consequences for Obamacare and immigration reform.
Following the defeat of the Democratic Party in the midterm elections, in which the Republican Party took control over the Senate, analysts say sometimes there will be commonalities with President Obama.
Some Republicans might be willing to make some kind of deal on immigration themselves, but not the same one that Obama wants. So we'll have to see. That is one of the main battlegrounds to see how cooperative the two sides are going to be.
The Republican Party has widely slammed Obamacare, and in light of the results, many question what the future will bring for this health care law, the banner of Obama's administration.
Can't repeal the health care law because Obama would veto that legislation. What they could do is create mischief by defunding aspect of it and a larger spending bill, which means they might say, take this or leave it, where we'll shut down the government if you don't do this.
National media highlights that what caused the Democrat defeat was disappointment over Obama, especially regarding the economy, leading to different reactions on the streets.
The common Democratic candidate intends to support poor communities, meanwhile Republicans favor wealthier communities.
Cesar, like many people, sees this result as a setback for the Latino community.
Immigration reform is now likely to happen since Republicans now control both the Senate and the House of Representatives. John Boehner, Speaker of the House, has made it difficult to have an immigration reform. Things will be worse.
En las elecciones de medio término participaron solo el 50% de los registrados para sufragar.
According to analysts, just 50% of those registered voters turned out in the midterm elections, confirming people's disappointment with all political parties. After responding to his party's defeat, Obama said he heard the message of those who voted and those who didn't.
Well, that's all for today's The Real USA. Don't forget to send us your comments to our Twitter @Telesur English. I'm Alexandra Hall. See you next time.